it's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Held off the cages out and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Hi, welcome to Pegasus Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 23 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber or follower on Substack or support me on Patreon. The website it will be in the description section of this podcast below. So welcome everybody. I have new subscribers, new followers on Substack. So I want to say welcome and thank you for joining my little space on Substack, and all the people that have been there for longer than a week. Thank you for your continued support. For all the new people, this particular weekly unscripted broadcast is exactly what it is. It's unscripted. I talk about the 3 to 4 papers that I wrote during the week, articles I wrote during the week. I call papers because I think I'm still in college. For the articles I write on Substack, and I just kind of go over some of my additional thoughts and truly unscripted thoughts. When I say unscripted, I have some bullet points to talk about, and then I just go from there, and sometimes I ramble, sometimes I don't. So that's what this particular podcast is about. So the papers, the articles that I wrote this week are China's Premier Xi Jinping reshaping the People's Liberation Army, Belarus practicing strategic ambiguity or confused foreign policy, the West Philippine Sea newsletter number 11, and an attempt to understand the impact of the Kursk offensive. So I got my water with me so I don't try to cough my way through like I did last week at the end. So bear with me, and I'll try to go a little bit further or a little bit quicker than I did last week. I went for over 2 hours on 3 articles, so that was an impressively long amount of time, which I suspect there was probably a fair amount of rambling involved on my behalf. So we'll go a little bit, try to go a little bit briefer on this one. I try to keep it to 90 minutes, but this one is 4 papers, so I could see this one going for 2 hours, but we'll see. So the first one, the China's Premier Xi Jinping reshaping the People's Liberation Army. So a couple things we need to know about the People's Liberation Army, which includes the People's Liberation Army Navy, People's Liberation Army Air Force, and then they have a name for their rocket forces, which I still think is under the PLA, but they've got a special army or division name under it. But the PLA is kind of a broad term. PLA largely regarding the Army, the PLAN, the Navy, the PLAAF, the Air Force. So those are often terms. So when I talk about PLA, I'm considering all their armed forces combined. The PLA, unlike normal national armies, like let's say, for example, I'm from the United States, but let's say some listeners that are in United Kingdom or Germany or the Netherlands, the army of those nations belong to the nation and not to the political party. The communist systems are unusual in that the Red Army of the former Soviet Union, in this case the PLA, they are the armed force of the Chinese Communist Party, Russia, obviously, or Soviet Union, the member of the Communist Party, or the armed wing of the of the Communist Party. So that's where it's a little bit an oddity in one aspect. And so where the U.S., where I live, the U.S. Army serves the nation, not dedicated to any political party. That's not the case in most communist systems, including the Chinese Communist Party. So this makes it different. But the one thing that kind of stands out is China is a one-party nation, so it is hard to divide out what is the state and what is the party, because the party is the only party of the state. So oftentimes it seems like a difference without a distinction. So that is a legitimate argument, but it goes into becomes because it's a member of the Chinese Communist Party and not part of the nation. It is a political um, it it is a political, for lack of a better term, it's a political monster in itself. It's a political organization, not just an armed force, because it serves the role as serving the protectorate of the Communist Party. That's why you see oftentimes in communist systems, you see leaders, military leaders, generals, marshals, whatever, admirals, in the high level political debate. So you often see them in the Politburos, in the Central Committee. The military holds a role within the party itself and not there just to support the state. So it's just a distinction of communist systems. So it's always kind of good to put that in your head when you're thinking about these various political systems and how they treat the armed forces. So Xi Jinping has used the non-military roles of the PLA, as I talked about, that they sit in the Central Committee or they can sit in the Politburo to support his own ends. So he's using oftentimes he uses his anti-corruption campaign. Now, there is true, real corruption in China. You could probably argue it. It's all over the world. But you look at the Chinese system, corruption is a significant problem for the country, and the leaders know about that. But oftentimes, anti-corruption initiatives inside this CCP is to serve the political ends of Xi Jinping, because there's even though it's a one-party state and it's Communist Party, obviously there is factions within the Chinese Communist Party that favor one leader over another. China has always acknowledged the factionalism within their Communist Party. That's why they used to have a rotating presidency based on the factions within the Communist Party. Obviously, they don't call them factions, but there are factions within the Communist Party where you have Xi supporters and you have other supporters, younger coming up supporters. I think Xi is 70 years old, maybe 69. I think he's 70 years old. So there's younger leaders coming up. Now, why this matters is that, so even though you sit there and say one party in the system, and you could say for a large extent it is true, but there's factions within the party itself. And to satisfy those factions, what they used to do is they used to rotate the presidents I think they could run no more than 2 terms, which basically was just 1 term, or in practicality, just 1 term. Xi broke that model. He was able to force enough of his political allies into decision-making roles, and he is able to make himself basically the lifetime president of China, basically, in all essence, a true dictatorship. So that was very unusual for China. And he uses this anti-corruption campaign against the PLA to place his people in key areas. Now, he does use true anti-corruption when there is true anti-corruptive practices. He uses that. He does use anti-corruption campaign to get rid of those actors. But in essence, he uses anti-corruption to use it as an excuse to put the leaders he wants in place. And he will use it as a measure of control, that if this person dissatisfies him or is unable to fulfill his goals, he will use, again, the guise of anti-corruption to get rid of this particular person. And also that goes into the anti-corruption exercises is like a legitimate one. This one's kind of like crosses into 2 areas. There's obviously corruption in the rocket forces. The rocket missile forces are a significant part of China's efforts to elevate their military. And this was a case where there was true corruption and there was people that failed Xi in meeting his obligation or what he expected of him. So he used anti-corruption to get rid of them. So that was a case where it actually had a dual use, where anti-corruption, it was happening. Now, I'm going to sit there and say, for the most part, Xi wants political reliability, and he wants people in place to meet his goals. And that's if you're any type of leader, whether system, okay, generally you're going to put people that support you and then people that can achieve your goals. If they fail to meet those goals, he uses, again, anti-corruption to get rid of the person. But in the end, he doesn't really care about corruption as long as you are able to achieve his goals. If you can achieve the goals that President Xi wants, he will let corruption go as long as it doesn't interfere with the objectives he's trying to commit. So if he's saying, for example, he wants you to build, wants a person to build 1,500 warheads by the end of 2030, nuclear warheads and missiles by the end of the 2030s, he doesn't care if you run some off-base factory making, I don't know, T-shirts and selling them to countries around the world that pad the pockets of the general in charge of it, as long as it doesn't interfere with attaining the goal of 1,500 nuclear missiles by the end of 2030. So that's where he's not an anti-corruption fighter, but anti-corruption carries a message within the Chinese society, especially from previous leaders that were definitely corrupt. You see it more at the local level. So he's used this as a guise to show that he's a person of the people and not necessarily, so he comes up anti-corruption, he's a person of the people, but in actuality, it's a tool for him to forward his progress, put his people that he wants in charge to attain his goals put in place. So Premier Xi is also the most committed communist since the departure of the revolutionary leaders who served alongside Mao. Now, why I say that is you've seen many, or we've all experienced, if you start looking through more and more of Chinese politics and economics, you're starting to see more and more control being exerted in the economy and less free market. So Xi has made it a point that he wants to put more controls over the business and even foreign industries working inside China. He wants to exert more control over these. This is something they really have not experienced since the first rollout of the, I guess they called them, free economic zones when Deng Xiaoping was the premier and he first started introducing market reforms. This is the first time that you see a rollback in the free market within China. And it's funny, China is also running into more and more headwinds when it comes to their economy growing. So at a time when you want to probably deregulate the economy to speed up economic growth, he is putting the state's foot on it to slow down economic growth and exerting more control over the economy and also over the people. So he's kind of doing that opposite of when they're having troubles with their economy right now, and instead of doing things to expand the economy, he's doing things to contract it so that he can exert more control over it. Now, so that makes Xi unusual, and I'll come back to why that kind of stands out. Is also China's obviously the second largest economy, and this provides Xi a unique opportunity to make the PLA a more capable and lethal force. This where let's say the Korean War, China was a very powerful military, but it was a continental military. It could not project power. It could hold down Russian forces along its border in Asia. It could obviously interfere in the Korean Peninsula during the Korean War in 1950. But it wasn't one that could project force. Now, China was a large country, but a very poor country. Now, all those market reforms starting under Deng Xiaoping have made China the second largest economy. So not only do they have the population, and read my article on here about China's demographic time bomb, very instructive about some of these, where China's heading. But China right now has a very large population. They have the second largest economy. So this provides Xi a unique opportunity to make the PLA more capable and more lethal. And you can easily argue that it is the most lethal, powerful military that China has ever possessed. And a lot of that is the amount of money that Xi has put into the military forces. Obviously, other Chinese leaders before Xi were putting money into the military. So it's not just him, but he's also given it a more aggressive mission. You obviously see China is much more active in the South China Sea. It's willing to have run-ins with the Philippines in particular, Vietnam to a lesser extent, Japan. Obviously, those aggressive exercises against Taiwan and the threats against Taiwan. So Xi has taken this powerful military that he's helped create, and he's really providing it. He's giving it more of a mission and an expectation. That's not to say that they're immediately going to go to war, but he's given them a more aggressive purpose to serve his vision of what would be a greater China. So I think this is also Xi, when I talk about he's used anti-corruption to put people he wants in place. He relies on these political allies, in particular the PLA, and he believes this is crucial in achieving his place in history. He wants to create a greater China. He wants to create himself as being viewed as one of the great leaders of China. So he's got a little, I don't know, for better purpose, a little bit of a megalomaniac personality. He wants to be the person to put the greater China on the map. Again, he is older. He's in his 70s. And even if you have a lifetime commitment, he's old. He's fighting that time bomb, and then also he has the demographic time bomb. So he is trying to maybe trying to force some of these crises going on throughout the world, where again, particularly in the Western Pacific and the South China Sea, to promote the idea of a greater China, and he relies on the PLA to do it. He gives them money. He gives them a mission. He uses anti-corruption to put the right people in place to drive his goals, which again, when I talk about put people in his position, there might be other people within China, other leaders in China that may not want to be so bold on the world stage as what Xi is trying to do, where Xi is very confrontational, at least up to the point of actual threats of shooting. He will push that edge right up to the edge of confrontation. Again, go back and forth, and I've been writing about today the gray zone tactics. So, so he uses his anti-corruption campaign to take out his opponents within the political within parts of the CCP. So. Also, when I talk about it, is Xi continues to impose periodic purges to control the PLA leadership and maintain their loyalty. Also, when he appoints somebody and they get into corruption that interferes with their mission, or if they fail to meet the goals that Xi wants, he again replaces them. He still does periodic purges. So nobody knows. So all these leaders in the PLA, and to an extent the CCP, the non-military members of the Communist Party, is they know that their positions are largely at the serve Xi, and when it no longer serves his purposes, you are expendable. So there's that sense of fear that he leaves within the CCP to maintain their loyalty. But the fact is, he cannot use these purges, he cannot use the anti-corruption campaign, he cannot use these as the only way to control the PLA. Because again, Xi has, I don't want to say enemies, but he has rivals within the CCP. So he cannot just use these purges to maintain the count. So he has to balance between controlling the PLA to achieve his goals and maintain their loyalty. So he has to allow some ability of corruption for these leaders so that they can profit off their positions and their association with the Chinese leader. So he has to use this as a way of maintaining his power because, again, he cannot do it by control alone. Now, having said that, first off, Xi cannot be everywhere. The communist leaders cannot be anywhere, everywhere. So he has reintroduced the political officer position within the PLA. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. Is as I talk about force projection, there will be cases, especially, for example, I think, was it USNI? Can't remember the source. They talked about the issue with China's concerns of having their nuclear submarines operating in patrol zones. These are the nuclear armed submarines, the ones with the submarine launched ballistic missiles. So that they are out on patrol for long periods of time without any oversight from the political leaders in Beijing, and they have to operate months at a time. So there's a little bit of concern that they're not maintaining control, and there's a little bit of issues with political reliability. So they were to address this issue was they created, for the lack of a better purpose, a professional political officer position, and this person basically holds the serves within the leadership and basically is a co-commander of, let's say, the captain of the submarine. He will have a corresponding political officer. A battalion commander will have a corresponding political officer. Somebody in the missile forces, the missile regiment, will have a corresponding political officer. And the military commander is still considered the top commander or of the unit, but he runs military operations, political education, indoctrination, and basically a rubber stamp of military decisions that align with party policy is what the role of the political officer. So the political officer actually has the ability to override the commanding officer. Can also has a direct input back to the, I think, the Chinese Central Military Commission. He could report back. They have the ability to report up through that channel about possible disloyalty or a military officer not serving within the maybe the boundaries or the loyalty that they want to see from the state. So there is a way that the political officers can communicate up through to the Central Military Commission about possible disloyalty or reporting an officer that failed to do their duty, case where maybe they're actually into corruption and that corruption has interfered with their official duties. There is a minder there for every political or for every military leadership position, that there's a corresponding level of political observation, which ultimately leads into some form of political control. Now, I talked about the professional political officer class. These people are not brought up as military officers. Maybe they started out in the military and then they converted over to the political branch. It's a little bit different in the lower army levels. From what I read, is they don't have the ability to go bring up cadres of political officers for every battalion within the People's Liberation Army. So what you'll do is oftentimes the what we would call executive officer or second in command in many of the People's Liberation Army, at least at the lower levels, the leader is actually a professional military officer who switches over to training, morale, and political duties, and where the commanding officer is, again, operational. So that's a case where you see in the Army is that you'll actually see a professional military officer that takes on political responsibilities. But in some of the more important levels, the higher levels, you're seeing that an actual professional political officer brought up to the ranks. So this is basically bringing in the commissar system that you used to see in the old Soviet Union. Now, the issue with this is it adds a new decision element into the command and decision process, and this can make a difference in the battlefield. So I talked about earlier about Xi being the most communist leader since the revolutionary leaders of Mao Zedong. So he is reintroducing political officers at the same time that he's trying to make the PLA more professional. So the issue with this, and again, talk about him exerting control in the economy. He's exerting control into the lower level decision making of the army. Now, why I say that is these political officers serve in the second role, and they have a ability to report back up to any view of disloyalty or decisions that are made contrary to the party's decision. And that's what these new commissars do. Now, the issue with this is that you're adding, first off, even if they're saying that they're not adding a level of control, and it's questionable whether in the nuclear submarines, when it talks about some of the operational perspectives, God forbid, a launch of a nuclear missile, I think the political officer has an actual say-so in the launching of the missiles, where there has to be an agreement between the military officer and the political officer to launch missiles. Hopefully, we'll never ever come to that. But in just the normal decision-making cycle, let's say a Army officer makes a decision that it's best to retreat, but that's contrary to political policies. So he's got to make the decision. The commanding officers has to start thinking that, okay, this is the best decision from the military perspective, but it is going contrary to party belief. And so they stop to debate the conversation, stop and debate a performance or a decision with a political officer to get sign off from the political authority that yes, retreat is the best decision, or something like that. What you're doing is you're adding a new step, or an officer who does, or a commanding officer who doesn't want to add that new step and acts out on their own authority, they're still going to have in their mind that their decision is going to be regarded, it's going to be reviewed, it's going to be looked at. So there's nothing, I talked about that, there's nothing like the idea of an commanding officer looking over their shoulder, wondering if their decisions is a politically sound decision, not a military sound decision, a military and politically sound decision. The PLA is also, again, a part of the Communist Party. Their military is political with them. I can't argue that it's saying that the military in the West, that there's not a political element, but there's not political officers, military decisions. There's a pretty hard line. I can especially speak with the U.S., is that there is a very hard line where it's the mission, then the military decision is the primary decision on, or is it is the reason for a military decision. They don't go back and consider political ramifications. There might be political ramifications for the decisions, but the political ramifications do not occur at the point of decision making. They do in the PLA. So this is a issue. And so Stalin during World War II, I'll bring it back to this, is that he did have a political officer system. And after those disastrous defeats against the Wehrmacht in 1941 and up to 1942, the political officers had basically second in command authority. So they had, finally, I think Zhukov, trying to think who would have been the other officer, is they basically said that, convinced Stalin that he needed to get rid of the political officers and let the commanders in the field command and not worry about political decisions. Not saying this is the reason. The victories started coming for the Russian army, the Red Army in the Soviet Union. The defeats were fewer and farther between. Those great encirclements of the prior year where decisions were held up because they ran contrary to the political officer or political ideology. So Stalin got rid of it. He reintroduced it in 1944 when the war was won. But even then, back in World War II, where the tempo of operations were slower than they are today, and there wasn't as many variables that commanding officers have to make a decision in the modern battlefield. And so just like Xi waiting on putting the weights on the economy with more control over foreign imports, more control over military officers serving basically at his leisure, and now putting the political officers in the military to exert more and more control. So he's doing a lot of things that are questionable. It's probably increasing the loyalty of the PLA to Xi, but that seems kind of contrary because it's loyal to, in the end, it's becoming loyal to Xi, not loyal to the party. So he's kind of setting this up that it's becoming more and more, first off, he's adopting more and more communist style leadership policies that have not served China well. China did better when it started freeing up the markets. Now he's putting his thumb back on the scale towards a operation. So he's making decisions and wanting the PLA to be able to fight that modern war against a peer adversary, and he's tying a lot of the leadership, putting one hand behind their back. So I don't know if this means that he doesn't truly want to fight a war, or is political reliability more important, where he can use gray zone tactics to give a political discipline within the PLA. They have to have a capability. They have to have all that money spent on them to create a legitimate capability. But does he want to assert so much political control over the PLA that it can follow his rules and his expectations all the way up to the point of war, and not be ill-disciplined enough where it could make a decision that starts a war? He wants them so politically aligned, so politically loyal, that they make decisions that are based on what he wants to accomplish. And maybe he doesn't want to accomplish war because he's making these decisions that actually will hurt to the PLA's ability to fight a war. So he seems like he's giving up operational capability in exchange for political reliability by introducing this Commissar system. Maybe I'm reading too much in it, that he wants to create what's called military operations other than war. So he wants to create a very politically reliable PLA that has the legitimate military power behind it, that it could go to war, but he's maybe taking it up there is that he's using it up to the point of war. So I think they called it the soft use of hard power to obtain political ends and avoid a major war. And that seems like a viable explanation when you look at the fact is that China is doing things to make themselves stronger from the strategic point of view, making themselves a strong, legitimate military power. And you can't threaten soft use of hard power if you lack the actual hard capability. So he has to build up their ability, but then he wants to take it up to that point and then not actually go to war. And I wrote about the paper today that posted, will not be part of the discussion today, about the gray zone tactics and maybe taking things up to wanting to fight a war in Taiwan, or take it all the way up to wanting to fight a war and then not actually committing itself to a military campaign. So there's a lot of questions about why you would introduce a Commissar system and trade off the ability to operate effectively in a rapid action-reaction cycle that it's expected of modern militaries, a modern war that China has not fought, and he's been putting more basically he's adding another decision-making process in the action-reaction cycle, which is only going to slow China down. So it just makes me wonder if it's the political reliability is more important than anything else. And then Xi being kind of the megalomaniac leader, it's turning into more of having loyalty to him than over the Communist Party. Not saying that he's not a communist at all. It's just saying that his place in history seems more important to him than anything else. He wants to be the one to create a greater China. So I'm sure I'll think more about this. I'll write more about it, but it just seems like this is a decision to avoid a war but have the actual legitimate military power, that it does have a credible military force behind it to make these gray zone or soft use of hard power actually a legitimate form. So, sure, more to come. It's just my thoughts, but there's just seems like adding when you need a more rapid action reaction cycle, you're adding a step that's going to slow that down and put them in the back seat against a peer adversary like the United States or somebody like Japan, which would, and to a lesser extent, Australia and New Zealand. So more to come, just my thoughts. So going over to Belarus. So we're switching over, going back over to Europe. So Belarus is practicing strategic ambiguity or a confused foreign policy. So this kind of stems out of the Ukraine operations in the Russian Kursk and the Sumy Oblast that has shifted the focus of the war from the east and south of Ukraine to the north. And this is causing concerns about the its causes, the effects, and the potential changes of this offensive in the north. Belarus is a close ally of Russia and President Vladimir Putin. And he has been what I called a passively active participant in the Russian war. Belarus borders Ukraine's north. It also borders Poland to its west. Poland's eastern border, Belarus's eastern border or western border. So it borders the two pretty volatile regions. Why I say that he's passively active is he allows Russian forces to operate freely within Belarusian territory. He allows air forces and missiles to pass through Belarusian airspace. He allowed Russian troops to launch at the beginning of the war in February 2022. He allowed Russian forces to operate out of Belarus to threaten Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. They have since obviously withdrawn from that offensive. So he has he has helped Russia, and again, he is a very close ally to Vladimir Putin. So as the war started going badly for Russia, Russia started doing the nuclear saber rattling, and Belarus, as a result, has agreed to host Russian military nuclear weapons on its soil, and it has participated in nuclear drills with Russian troops on Belarus territory. And he has contributed to these nuclear threats from Putin against NATO because he continues to conduct nuclear drills and joint exercises with Russia, particularly with nuclear weapons. So again, Belarus borders Poland, so it's right there on the NATO border, along with bordering Ukraine. So his threats bring those tactical nuclear threats closer to the NATO border. So after the invasion of Kursk, that's when the Ukraine forces invaded the northern territory into Kursk, part of southern Russia, not southern Russia, but in the southern border with Ukraine. The Ukraine forces launched an operation, and I'm writing more about that as well. We'll discuss that later. So once this invasion started in Kursk, the Belarusians have stated that Ukraine wanted to expand its war against Russia and conduct military operations in Belarus. Now, that kind of seems ridiculous on its face. Ukraine has its hands full, and it doesn't want to start a war with Belarus. It doesn't want to expand its frontier. And there's risk the current operation that it's conducting, and I'll talk more about that at the last paper. So Belarus doesn't have, it hasn't broken off diplomatic relations with Ukraine, but there's not a Ukraine ambassador there, but they do have an an office there. So they haven't closed the embassy, but it's basically, there's nobody really of significant importance there. So Belarus called the European Union's ambassador and stated that Belarus would not tolerate any incursions of drones from Ukraine into its airspace, or would it allow the probably more concerning is Ukrainian troops crossing into the Belarusian border. Now, he threatened nuclear response if Ukraine had invaded, not just with drones, but invaded Belarusian territory. Now, again, that's not going to happen because I think the Ukrainians, I have a lot of, if you've read enough about me, I've had a lot of concerns about the conduct of the war, both on the Ukraine side and the Russian side. Just to give everybody my general opinion going into this, since I have so many new readers and they may not have read a lot of what I've talked about, is the war in Ukraine is the Russians had no reason to invade. There was no immediate threat to Russia. Yes, they did have security concerns with NATO creeping ever closer to their borders. So the concern of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, which NATO had started talking about Ukraine membership of NATO as early as 2008. But I've been basically an opponent of Russia. I've been thinking that yes, Ukraine is the aggrieved party. They were making decisions to agitate the Russians. Read my very first paper. I kind of go a lot through the war. So won't go into that, but basically I've been critical of both sides, and I've been consistently calling that there needs to be peace in this war before it gets out of hand. So that's kind of my position. So Lukashenko had threatened to use nuclear weapons. First, he told the European Union ambassador they would not tolerate Ukrainians using drones in Belarusian airspace. But he also hinted that he would attack any Ukraine force that crossed into his border with nuclear weapons. Of course, these are Russian nuclear weapons that they've been training with. And it's unclear, but highly doubtful, that President Putin has given launch authority to Alexander Lukashenko to use against any force, whether it's Ukraine or NATO troops along the Polish border. So it's doubtful he has launch authority. This feels like a lot more typical bluster coming out of that region. But it has kind of raised up some of the remarks in there. My argument, it doesn't seem like Ukraine has an interest in expanding the war with Belarus. That means it would have a broader front almost all the way to the Polish border to defend, and not just the borders along Donbass and Crimea. So it would greatly expand the war for Ukraine. It doesn't really make any sense from a military capability aspect to be able to expand the war. So it sounded like a lot of bluster from Lukashenko. Now, one thing that kind of came out, when I wrote this paper, a yet to be broadcast with Russian media had been conducted, but they hadn't been released yet. President Lukashenko made the remarks that to Russian media asserting that NATO orchestrated the war in Ukraine to weaken both Ukraine and Russia. And so he can argue this because the reason for the Ukraine operation in Kursk is not publicly known, and it is just speculated for several reasons, an attempt to bring Russia to the peace talks. There's some strange ones about attacking a nuclear power plant. We'll go into this one later on. But what he had done is he had created a common cause that tied Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus that they were being they had a common cause against NATO, because NATO was using Ukraine against the Russians, and the Russians were fighting a war against the Ukrainians, which was all benefiting NATO. Now, this is all coming from Lukashenko's point of view. But what he did is he created that common cause. So, and because they don't know the reason for the war, that common cause is easier for it to take place. Now, I'm not saying the Ukrainians are doing anything wrong by not saying the reason for their operation in Kursk, because strategic ambiguity, I bring that up a lot. You don't sit there and telegraph what your objectives in that particular region are. So but because of that strategic ambiguity, that the Lukashenko was able to fill in the gaps. I did some work on strategic communications and really started kind of reading into how it works. This would be a case where strategic communication could have really have served Ukraine's purpose, but they didn't do it. They chose the right path of strategic ambiguity, not to give away what they were trying to attempt in Kursk, but they also allowed the Belarusian president to fill the gap with his own ideas of what was going on in Kursk. So one thing that kind of goes in there is that it seems like the most likely reason is Ukraine needs some form of military victory. Ukraine is trying to get peace talks started in as early as November, and they don't want the disaster of the Swiss peace talks they had earlier this year that were the Russians were not invited. That did not go over well with the world stage, and all I could do was create a weak, watered down statement from that. They couldn't get all the participants to agree to. So they're trying to avoid that and trying to bring into a case where they're actually bringing the Russians in and have some form of peace talks with it. There was some actual peace talks that going in Qatar. We'll talk about that here later on the fourth paper. So the one discussion is that the Ukraine needed some type of victory. They needed something, especially over the Russians have been on the offensive for the winter, the summer, or the spring and the summer. So they've been on the offensive for almost a year. And the Ukrainians have basically been on the strategic defensive. Probably the right decision because they needed to preserve their manpower as much as it was, because they are at manpower disadvantage. They are getting pushed back in the east, but they have not given up a lot of ground. Not sure how many casualties they're giving up to keep the ground, but they have prevented any large breakthroughs of the Russian forces. But they needed to have some time. They couldn't be on the constant defensive and expect to get any real progress at the peace talks, because they would truly be in a position of weakness, and then the Russians could dictate it, or the Russians wouldn't be interested in peace talks alone, because why negotiate anything that you can just take on the battlefield? So they needed to have something to incentivize the Russians. So this is the lead cause of why the Kursk operation is taking place. So, but two key Russian allies, the Chinese and now the Belarusians, are discussing the need to negotiate the war. There's some issues going on with dual-use products, threats of Western sanctions, payment terms. There's also disagreement with the Chinese and the Russians over a pipeline. So there is some things where China seems to be showing some signs of being uneasy about the war. They've got enough issues with their economy that they can't threaten they don't want to deal with Western sanctions, because if the Western sanctions occur, these facilitators of dual-use products, which are products that can be used for both war and peaceful purposes, these companies that provide dual-use products that are selling them to the Russians, or usually through a third party, also sell to the West. If they get sanctioned, they will not be able to sell to the West, and the Western sales are much more lucrative than the Russian sales. So China's getting a little nervous, so they're putting pressure. They've got their own, I think, a 6-point peace plan. They've actually got the Ukrainians to somewhat agree with the Chinese position, though the Ukrainians aren't completely signed on with the Chinese peace plan. But Chinese are making headway, and they got the Ukrainians to agree to the one China policy in exchange for Chinese support for the peace talks and the Chinese announced that the Ukrainians would be eligible for the Belt and Road Initiative. Um, I disagree with that. That's just again through supporting the One China policy. But they did offer it so that you have the Chinese and the Belarusians, basically Chinese from a financial point of view and probably somewhat of a prestige point of view, are pushing for peace talks. Belarusians are pushing for peace talks by creating this unusual off ramp that the Russians might be willing to take, where continuing the war in the Belarusians' point of view is that creating a peace would actually foil NATO's plans to weaken Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. So an unusual off ramp, but it does push for the idea of ending the war. And then you got to understand that you got Viktor Orban as well, who's the president of the EU, seeking ways for peace talks as well. So this is an initial off-ramp for to initiate negotiations, because it is a face-saving measure when he creates the common cause of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia against the West. And so it's not likely, and I don't think anybody really believes it, but I think it's a way for Lukashenko to try to promote the idea of peace. Now, Lukashenko does not want to get general war. He threatens, but he doesn't want to expand a war with Ukraine or the West. And I think he was elected in 2020, widespread reported cheating at the polls. And so he's got kind of a fragile hold on society. There was a lot of protests when that after the presidential election. It is doubtful that he could stand up to a war and maintain his society. So I think he also wants to see an end to the war. So it was an interesting thing where he talked about using nuclear weapons against Ukraine, but then also creating a common cause with the Ukrainians and the Russians to push forward a peace talk. So not sure what he's doing, if he knows what he's doing, if he's confused, don't know. But it was an interesting way of creating that common cause with the Ukrainians. So more to come on that. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Kursk offensive at the end of this podcast today. All right, so the West Philippine Sea Newsletter, Volume 11. Well, the tensions have started up again in the West Philippine Seas. Shock, shock. There was an agreement prior to the ASEAN conference between the Philippines and China, especially after the call them the Chinese pirates attacked Chinese Coast Guard and naval personnel that were trying to resupply the Sierra Madre in the Second Thomas Shoal. After that, the ASEAN conference called a meeting in Laos to discuss the ongoing tensions in the South China Sea and the civil war in Myanmar. And they invited non-ASEAN countries, Australia, U.S., China, and Russia to attend, and India to attend the conference as well, to discuss that. So prior to the conference, and I think a lot of it was for face-saving purposes, was China agreed to have a system where they allow for resupply of the second Thomas Shoal to the BRP Sierra Madre in advance. If the Philippines in advance notifies China that they're going to run a resupply mission, and as long as there's not building materials being brought aboard, China would let them go forward, and that seems to have been working. Now, the issue is that basically the Philippines had to tell the Chinese that they were going to go to Philippines' own internationally recognized territory on their warship, because even though Sierra Madre is grounded, it was purposely grounded, it is still a commissioned warship. So it has a special status in international law, and basically what's happening is the to de-escalate tensions, the Philippines agreed to notify China before going to their own territory. So China says that it was a big compromise on their behalf. I think it was a much bigger compromise on the Philippines' behalf because they were the ones that were giving into. They basically surrendered part of their sovereignty to reach some type of de-escalation with China. So it seemed like that had been something that was actually starting to take down the pressure in the region. Well, and that seemed to be timed with the ASEAN conference. So they said, hey, China can go and say, hey, we've already taken steps to de-escalate tension in the region. It's working. We don't need to talk about it. We don't need to be pointing fingers about the unreasonableness of China. So it did succeed from a PR perspective. Is the ASEAN conference did not put a lot of focus on China because it looked like they had a working system in place. Obviously, there's other South China Sea issues, mainly with Vietnam and Malaysia, but the biggest focus was the escalating tensions between the Philippines. And it did seem to take a lot of the focus off of that particular issue, though Chinese did get annoyed that just prior to the ASEAN conference, the U.S. Offered a $500 million grant to the Philippines to upgrade military facilities that the Philippines are allowing U.S. forces to operate in, and some other things, some other activities that will allow for greater technology sharing, mainly in the areas of weapons and reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, allow China or Philippines more access to this. So that kind of annoyed the Chinese during the ASEAN conference. But for the most part, the Chinese were kind of given what really to me felt like a free pass because of this agreement with the Sierra Madre. So what's been coming up going into this week, leading up to some of the escalations, is the U.S. deployed a Typhoon missile system in the Philippines in April 2024 as part of, I think, Salacanib 2024 exercise. This was not used in the live fire portion of the exercise. It was really meant for the U.S. to practice flying and deploying a missile system. It was also meant as a way for Philippines armed forces to work with this type of equipment and how they could jointly work together to basically secure a location for the missiles and then the setup of the missiles. Typhoon is a mobile missile system. It was not made for permanent deployment. It flies into areas where maybe there's a capability gap or where tensions increase. The Typhoon can fire a ground-based version of the Tomahawk cruise missile. It can fire the Navy's SM-6 multi-purpose missile, which can be used to shoot down aircraft and missiles. It can also be used to attack ground targets. So it's a multi-purpose missile. So Typhoon is it's the vertical launch system that's used in U.S. Navy ships and basically made it a ground-based version of that. And then eventually it's supposed to be able to have support the Mako hypersonic missile when that is available. So this Typhoon system has been placed on the Philippine Islands as part of Salacanib, and it was not withdrawn. So this started becoming an issue with the Chinese Foreign Secretary Wang Yi when he had a call with Philippine Foreign Secretary Enrique Manalo to protest the military deployment of U.S. missiles, arguing that it's destabilizing to the region. China argues anything's destabilizing to the region when a foreign power is brought into the region. So the U.S. has a defense agreement. I think it's the oldest defense agreement with the Philippines. Obviously has ones with Japan as well, South Korea. All these are viewed by China as destabilizing to the region because they're bringing in. China says that meaning these countries inside the South China Sea and the Western Pacific, they are bringing in foreign elements, and that is the United States, Japan, uh, United Kingdom, France, lesser extent, United Kingdom, France, lesser extent. So this is, they argue that any of these, bringing these foreign areas are destabilizing to the region. Also, what's destabilizing is if, let's say, Philippines and Vietnam combine together to protest China, that's destabilizing too, because they only want to work with, they being China only wants to work with countries on issues on a bilateral basis where it has all the power in that type of arrangement and the dynamics of that relationship. It's funny. Secretary Manalo said that the Chinese were being dramatic about this, and he basically told them not worry about it. This is not; these are not permanent deployments. So I talked about the missile systems, that these were mobile. The Typhon system has a legitimate purpose of deterrence, and it increases capability in a region that, in case of hostilities. Obviously, there's a couple things going on. Is deterrence is okay. That increases the cost of China. Let's say in this case, China doing any type of military action in the South China Sea, is they would have to be faced with the possibility of U.S. missiles. And then the other one is deployment, is capability gap. If something happens where tensions start increasing, you start wanting to move equipment in, not as deterrent, but be able to respond in case of hostilities. So the Typhon serves those purposes. So the tensions are high in the region, and that probably, in my opinion, delayed the withdrawal of the Typhon system that was there since April. Also, the Typhon is new. The U.S. is trying to learn how to use it, how to deploy it, how to support it in the field. So they probably needed more time as well about how to deploy this outside of the United States, because this Typhon missile system is also going to be deployed to Germany starting, I think, in 2025. So there's still a lot of learning that the U.S. has to learn with about deploying and maintaining these missiles in the field. So there's probably some of that goes in it as well. Though I suspect that the U.S. is probably slow walking withdrawing the missiles because of all the hostility China is doing in the region. And this hostility includes escalating tensions with Philippines, Japan, and Taiwan. Again, talked about earlier about all those exercises against Taiwan. So, and they also China was with Russia, flew strategic bombers and fighters towards Alaska, and then they actually had to be intercepted. I'm basically not saying they shot them down. They just intercepted them from proceeding further in towards U.S. airspace. So China's been escalating the tensions in the region. So keeping the missiles in the region is a legitimate defense posture for the U.S. to take. Then another thing is that the French Navy has deployed a frigate in the region for some time and has been participating in drills with the U.S., Australia, the Philippines in several exercises. And I put this one in there because this is, again, that foreign element that annoys China. And France did something that you don't usually see in the U.S. Navy, is they don't, that ship had been there for about 6 months, I think. And instead of withdrawing it back to France, they basically flew a new crew into Japan to take over the ship and flew the old crew back to France. Instead of withdrawing the frigate from the region, they just left it there and just changed the crew out. That was kind of unusual. And again, so it's maintaining a small French presence in the region, again, which is an annoyance to China. Hand it one ship's not going to make a big deal, but it's, again, another foreign element that does serve to annoy China. Another thing that's coming up with foreign elements is the Royal Australian Navy and the U.S. Navy are participating in maintenance exercise with a U.S. submarine tender. And this is annoying China as well, and they protested the idea is this. This is ahead of the Royal Australian Navy is going to start receiving at some point in the future U.S. and British nuclear attack submarines. And so this is preparation for them to how to do the maintenance on a U.S. nuclear submarine. So a nuclear submarine will, the U.S. Australian Navy and the U.S. Navy are participating in a maintenance exercise with a U.S. submarine tender. And at some point, a U.S. submarine will join that tender to promote getting the Royal Australian Navy prepared to have its own nuclear submarines. And these submarines will be able to operate, instead of being diesel and limited in their range, these will be nuclear, and they will be able to work in seas closer to China. So this is a threat to China. And so this, again, was another annoyance with China, threatening destabilization of foreign elements into the region. So this brings us up into is that China was doing a fair amount of complaining about U.S., France, about missiles being deployed, saying it's escalatory while they're flying nuclear bombers towards the U.S. in Alaska. But that doesn't count in their eyes. So it's kind of tiresome. It's funny. It's funny in a way, just how their actions are virtuous and everybody else is destabilizing. The Philippine Coast Guard in the Sabina Shoal. This is the shoal that Philippines discovered a number of months ago of ground up coral and seabed damage were happening in the Sabina Shoal, which is in the West Philippine Sea or the Philippines exclusive economic zone. China has used ground up coral before as a way to build up artificial islands. So this appears to be a Chinese attempt to build artificial islands. So what the Philippines have done is that they've maintained a permanent presence in the Sabina Shoal to keep the Chinese from resuming building an artificial island. The Chinese have responded by sending their largest Coast Guard ship to shadow the largest Philippine Coast Guard ship. But the Philippines' presence has prevented any more construction occurring in the region in the Sabina Shoal. So on August 19th, the Philippine Coast Guard dispatched 2 ships to the Sabina Shoal to reinforce or to drop supplies off to, I think it was called Flat Island. And what happens is the Chinese intercepted these 2 Coast Guard ships. And when I say intercepted, they rammed both the Coast Guard ships, causing minor structural damage and no injuries to the ships. So this was the first ramming incident in quite some time, and the first major run-in between the Philippines and the Chinese since the agreement with the Second Thomas Shoal of advance notification, which tends to reinforce my idea that China just did this to get them past the ASEAN conference and any type of criticism of their foreign policy. So the Chinese Coast Guard intercepted the 2 Philippine ships. The Chinese claimed through their Coast Guard spokesman that the Philippine ships illegally entered Chinese waters. These is China claims the whole South China Sea, but the Sabina Shoal is, I think, only 80 miles from the closest Philippine territory and is well within the internationally recognized exclusive economic zone. Sabina Shoal is almost 1,000 miles from the closest Chinese territory. This kind of gives you an expanse of how much territory China is trying to claim, from all the way up to countries that are very close. Again, Philippines are very close to the Sabina Shoal, is part of their exclusive economic zone, but China has to go 10 times farther or more than that to get to the Sabina Shoal, and they claim that as their own over the Philippines. It's just an absolute ridiculous claim. But anyway, so the Chinese said that the Philippine ships were illegally entered Chinese waters and prompting the China to implement what's called, quote, control measures, end quote, against them, which was the ramming incident. Now, Manila's National Task Force confirmed the damage to the two Philippine Coast Guard ships and asserted that China Coast Guard had engaged in unlawful and aggressive maneuvers against the Philippine ships. The China claimed that the Philippine ships were illegally in the area, and they proceeded on to the Second Thomas Shoal after the incident, and in thus violation of the agreement between the China and Philippines over the resupplying of the Sierra Madre. Now, the Philippines has been very good in their disagreements with China. Is they've been very good using the media and documenting these occurrences with China, and so they've been actually very good at maintaining that ability to get their message out and word out first. But it looks like in this case they did document it, but they did not get the story out quicker. China actually beat them to the punch to broadcast to the world what the Philippines had done to them. Now, I find it very dubious that somehow the Philippines were, and the clips that the Chinese did provide, it does show ramming maneuvers. You could sit there and say, okay, whose fault was it? But it's a very short clip. So it doesn't show necessarily is what happened prior to it, of the happening. And also China rammed two ships. Now, the other fact is that most of the Chinese Coast Guard ships are former naval ships. They're bigger in size, they have more tonnage than the average Coast Guard ship, including the Coast Guard ships of the Philippine Navy that also, or Philippine Coast Guard. They also have bigger engines, more powerful engines. So it doesn't make sense for the Philippines to try to ram Chinese Coast Guard ships that are much bigger, much more powerful, because all you're going to do is damage yourself in the just amount of tonnage and velocity. The Philippine Coast Guard ships are not going to compare to a former, what used to be a warship. It just doesn't make much sense. Also, two Philippine ships were rammed. So it seems a little odd that the Chinese would, or the Philippines would risk two of their smaller ships in a ramming action that they have all the disadvantages in. So it doesn't really make much sense. And they haven't seen the full tape of the incident. It happened at 3:26 in the morning, so it's dark out. But the Philippines did allow, accidentally, I don't say accidentally, something happened where the Chinese beat them to the punch in the world opinion, and were able to kind of play the victim in the West Philippine Sea. So this hasn't caused any more incidents yet, and we're not sure if this has scuttled the agreement between the Second Thomas Shoal and the Sierra Madre, because China made the point that that by the Philippine ships going, or the Coast Guard ships going into the Second Thomas Shoal, once they left the Sabina Shoal after the ramming incident, that this was a violation of the agreement. So not sure how China will react to this, if it's going to be one of those statements where they'll use this as a reason to get out of the Second Thomas Shoal arrangement. Because again, they don't have to stay in it because the ASEAN conference is over. They've got their positive press out of it that they needed. So again, we'll just say there was no injuries in it. So fortunately, there is two damaged Philippine ships with what's being called minor structural damage. One of them actually has a pole punched in it, but it's above the water line. And I think I saw a picture below the water line where no leaking, but you could actually see where it's bulged in on the Philippine ships. So I'm sure more to come on this, but after a period of relative calm and apparent agreements to try to pull back on tensions in the South China Sea, they are back on the menu. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the near future, especially if the Philippines wanted to try another resupply to the Second Thomas Shoal in the Sierra Madre, which they will have to do soon. So I'm sure more will come from this. They might have actually been able to resupply. Oftentimes, what I see is that China goes in there and they do a couple of these escalations. They tend to back off initially, not to get any more bad press out of it. Because even though they beat the Philippines to the punch, it's many, many, many countries. I don't want to say most, but I want to say most. I still feel it's most. See the Philippine or the Chinese reactions to thing as being non-believable, pushing truth to their story-making ability. It pushes the believability factor, and if it wasn't so serious, it would actually be funny. Some of their statements that they put out. All right. So next, the final paper is an attempt to understand the impact of the Kursk offensive, and this is the offensive that Ukraine has actually invaded Russian territory. It's on their northern border. It is close to Belarus, and it is an invasion into Russian territory, and it did catch the Russians by surprise. Now, it's a little bit unclear on this. Is apparently the Russians had cleared a lot of the minefields in that area, and that allowed the Ukrainians to flow through that area. So it's unclear whether the Russians were considering an offensive of their own in this region. If they were, they didn't have the forces in the region immediately. So kind of questionable. And it seems like, reviewing facts, it seems like that is the case, that minefields were removed or at least thinned out. Did they remove the minefields to take them elsewhere and were going to conduct an offensive? But again, it wasn't heavily mined like it was when the last spring offensive the Ukrainians attempted, when they basically just in 2023, where they just went up against massive Russian fortifications, and even with Western military hardware, were not able to make any significant progress. So maybe they shifted mines from that region that was kind of a quiet front to the south, or did they think that they were going to do some operation later on in the year, but they didn't have the forces in the area, because all it was a bunch of conscripts and thinly manned positions in the region. So the Ukrainians were able to do a surprise offensive in the Kursk, and it is currently in its third week. The forward progress has largely stopped, and they advanced up to 22 kilometers. There are reports of raiding parties all the way up to 35 kilometers, but it doesn't look like they're trying to hold territory that far in advance. They're still moving slowly, but they've started blowing bridges across one of the rivers, which tells me that they're trying to keep the Russians from flowing reinforcements into the area and try to isolate the battlefield, where it's mainly more on the Russian side, more conscripts and inexperienced and undermanned units trying to fight the Ukrainians in this area. So obviously the initial shock has passed. New forces are being moved into the area, but it's not very fast. So it tells you that the Russians have really committed themselves more to the south in the Crimea area, and they don't have a lot of forces that completely move out of the region. Now, to argue on the Russian behalf, the Russians are still continuing their offensive in the east, in the Donbass. So it doesn't appear like they've really pulled back on their offensive in the south. So some of the arguments was that, or trying to figure out the reason for this offensive, was it was trying to draw away Russian forces from the south to stop that offensive. Also, when the Ukrainians had their spring offensive in 2022, they did do some misdirection where they attacked or feinted one way and then attacked another way after the Russians had shifted forces. So it could be the Russians are not going to fall for that. as well. It could be that. But anyway, the offensive has slowed to a crawl. They're starting to blow bridges across the river, which means they don't intend to operate across those rivers, and it tends to lean towards isolating the battlefield, so it's going to be harder for the Russians to move reinforcements in there. So it tends to think that they were running probably as far as the advance wants to go, and I have a couple of reasons for that. Is that the Russians haven't stopped the Ukrainian forces. It's the Ukrainians are deciding to slow down their advance. Yes, they are receiving more resistance, mainly through artillery bombardment and airstrikes, I think also missile strikes, but less from ground forces. But the Kursk, the advance into Kursk is a narrow front advance, creating basically a salient into the area. Every time you push further and further into a salient under a relatively narrow front, you're starting to push a narrow front into the region. All that front has to be manned. So if they're going to maintain this, so the further they push into the region, the more manpower they have to pour into the advance, which is going to be a long, narrow advance, because you're advancing from a broad front, or a narrow front, and not from a broad front. So every time they push further, they're going to have to keep manning those points along there, or they're going to be open to attack. If they get open to attack and they cut into the salient, you could end up cutting and isolating, encircling the Ukrainian forces. So they're not pushing very deeply in there. Also, the deeper the advance, the longer the supply lines become, and the more vulnerable they are. Because remember, Ukraine doesn't have air superiority in this region. Even though they got their first delivery of F-16s, they are not operating with air superiority, even over their own territory. They're not going to be able to operate air superiority in Russian territory. So if they start moving more and more of their logistics into Russia as the supply lines get longer, that they are more vulnerable that way. So there's no indication that Ukraine is moving their supply dumps forward into the region. It seems like they're keeping them in place. Also, what's the end of October, or beginning of October, you have the Rasputitsa, the mud season, going to start when the fall rains are. Most people think Rasputitsa happens in the winter thaw. It's actually, there's two seasons of it. One is when the fall rains occur. The other one happens when snow melts at the end of winter. So there's two periods where basically any cross-country movement, even with modern equipment, is very hard to do. So it kind of slows the tempo of any type of operation. This is giving Ukraine the ability to operate in this area, especially with the Russians not pulling forces out. The Ukrainians are going to be able to operate in this area for at least through the end of September. And at this point, I think then the campaign season ends. And so won't start again till the winter, when the ground has been hardens with the drying of the rains and the freezing of the ground. So this couple things this does is it gives Ukraine basically takes the initiative at the end of the campaign season. Yes, everybody knows the Russians have been slowly grinding offensive down in the eastern Ukraine and the Donbass. That's been known. That's kind of baked in the cake. No real expectation that the Ukrainians would be so bold as to invade Russia. So what this does is Ukraine has created a splash in the war at the end of the campaign season. So they're going to be able to carry this over. So they're going to be viewed as taking the initiative. Also, it's no secret, Ukraine needs some type of military victory. They need to create some type of pressure on Russia to come to the negotiating tables. And I think that that Ukraine is thinking about peace, because they've been polling their citizens about how open they would be with a peace settlement, or how tired they are of the war. Of course, Russia doesn't concern themselves with such polls. But the Ukrainians are polling their population about how open they are to peace. The I've written in a previous paper is the deputy deputy director of military intelligence for Ukraine has stated that there would be some type of negotiated settlement in 2025. The bond restructuring, the euro bond restructuring with the Ukraine seems to have indicated by the fact that there was debt forgiveness, and they offered that Ukraine would be able to borrow again once the hostilities end, are indications that Ukraine is signaling to its creditors that the war would be ending soon. Otherwise, the creditors would not have forgiven I think they allowed Ukraine to write off 36% of the debt and then restructure the payment structures. These creditors would not have done this if they thought that the war was going to continue on and on. And then, so there's the wanting peace negotiations in November, needing the Russians there, needing something to bring the Russians to the peace talks. There's also peace talks in Qatar, Doha, Qatar, between Russia and Ukraine. They weren't doing direct talks. I think, I'm not sure what countries were there, but Qatar was acting as an intermediary. There might have been some other intermediaries like Turkey, maybe. I think there's talk of Brazil, but I'm not 100% sure. But they were secret negotiations, and the purpose of the negotiations was that both sides not attack each other's energy infrastructure. And they were making progress in these talks, and the idea was that these talks could eventually move to a comprehensive ceasefire or be the background for a comprehensive ceasefire. So obviously, there's a lot of signal in the war that some form of peace talks directly between the Russians and the Ukrainians are in the works. It seems like the Ukraine side wants it. I talked about in the earlier paper is you have Lukashenko from Belarus creating this common cause. You have the Chinese agreeing to trying to push forward their 6-point peace plan and agreeing to participate in the next round of peace talks, which are tentatively scheduled in November if they can get the Russians to go. The Chinese are also putting some type of financial pressure on the Russians because the Chinese are feeling the threats of Western sanctions against some of their stakeholders. The Ukrainians agreed to the One China policy in exchange for Belt and Road Initiative eligibility after the war. I wrote about that could be a way for a negotiating tactic. Won't go into that in detail here. It's in the one paper that I wrote about about Ukraine's visit to China a couple weeks ago. So it just seems like there's a lot of things in place to try to get peace talks rolling and to push them further to end this war sometime in 2025. Now, a couple things is that, yes, Ukraine needed a victory because they needed to create some type of pressure on Russia, increase the cost of the war, and make them willing to negotiate. Now, is this going to make Russia come to the peace talks? No. Russia cannot come to the peace talks or agree to peace talks with the Kursk operation underway, because that would be the Russians coming to the peace table in basically a position of weakness. And they're not going to do that because they're strong. They've been on the offensive for nearly 9 months and have made slow, grinding progress. They're just not going to give in to peace talks just because this big splash of the Kursk offensive is occurring, which is a serious operation, but it's not life-threatening to the Russians. It's not the death of the empire, but it's the first invasion of Russia since World War II. And that's going to put pressure on their society they're going to recognize that, yes, Ukraine struck at their territory. Now, Ukraine's been striking at Belgorod, which is the Russian territory, the biggest city on the opposite side of the Donbass. They've struck Belgorod sometime, but they've never launched a ground offensive into the area towards Belgorod. So this is the first serious incursion of Russian territory since World War II. The whole point of the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War was to create buffer states to protect Russia from being invaded. So now that Russia has been invaded, now they're accusing NATO of participating. I'm sure there's NATO support going on, but I think this is what Ukraine needed, and it does put a lot of pressure on Russia. But Russia cannot immediately agree to ceasefire while the Kursk offensive is going. So they suspended Qatar talks, but they contacted their foreign partners to try to get in contact with Ukraine to exchange prisoners. Now, there was a recent prisoner exchange, so this is all of a sudden they're wanting to exchange these prisoners because a lot of the prisoners that are taken in the Kursk offensive are conscripts, they're draftees. And early in the war, when it looked like the war wasn't going to end in a few weeks like they originally suspected, and you start seeing more and more NATO aid, Russia looked at doing a partial or general mobilization. Well, this proved extremely unpopular with the population, and it threatened the support for the war within Russia. So this showed that Russia does care, Putin does care about what the public opinion says. They backed off on it. And they decided that they were going to fight the war with volunteers. So you could join the military and volunteer and go to Ukraine, or you could be a contractor like Wagner Group, or they can go get foreigners like North Koreans. And I think you have some foreign fighters, just like Ukraine has foreign fighters. Russia has foreign fighters: Chechens, Indians, North Koreans, Chinese. Just again, Ukraine has their own foreign fighters as well. So the idea is conscripts were not going to be deployed to battlefield areas in Ukraine, and that was to keep the society relatively isolated from the costs of the war. Well, now conscripts are being taken. They're operating on Russian soil, so now Russian society is impacted. So Russia has made immediate contact with its partners to try to arrange a prisoner exchange, because they want those conscripts back. They do not want to spread the costs of the war to parts of Russia that may not be in support of the war. So this is one of those things where Putin is reacting to public opinion. And so even though he can't go to the bargaining table with basically called the Kursk gun to his head, the pressure is on to him, and he's reacting to the pressure. So he might be looking at it between the Chinese, the Belarusians, and now this offensive creating some societal pressure that maybe at this point he is open to the idea of peace talks as well. But they needed something to get him to come to the bargaining table. You've got Lukashenko creating the common cause. You've got the Chinese creating the economic concerns about continuing the war. And again, Russia needs China's support for the war, even though China says, and it largely can be believed, they are not providing direct military aid. They are providing significant financial aid to Russia. They are maintaining trade, finding ways to get the goods that Russia needs to expand its arms industry. So they need Chinese support. So China's got putting the economic pressure on them, even talking to the Ukrainians to set up some type of peace talks. So it seems like there's a lot of pressure. And now you'll have the societal pressure from this Kursk offensive to put pressure on public support within Russia. So it looks like that's, again, it's a lot of pressure being placed on Russia. Ukraine wants peace talks. It seems like the writings on the wall with them is that they're wanting a way out of the war. Not saying that the Ukraine population is ready to throw up their hands and give up territory, but they're looking for a way to negotiate an end to the war. So now it's just a matter of how can you get the Russians to agree to peace talks. And so this is another way to pressure Russia into going into peace talks. Again, so you got economic pressure, you got common cause, you got societal the pressure all being put on Russia. Now, Russia would be less likely to react to this than Ukraine to all this pressure, but it is a impact to the war that they are starting to feel. So one thing is, if I talked about this, if Ukraine wants to maintain the societal impact to the Russians, because the Russians, again, they've already contacted partners to set up a prisoner exchange because they want those conscripts back. That seems to be a hot button issue. Already they know the issues that I talked about with general mobilization, that it was so unpopular. This is going to be unpopular. For Ukraine to keep the pressure on the Russians and the possibility of the society becoming soft on the war in Russia, they have to treat those Russian conscripts, they have to treat them humanely within the rules of war, because they don't want to incense the Russian population that the Russian leadership is concerned they could lose support. You don't want mistreatment of those POWs to become a rallying cause, when right now it's causing, Russia is really concerned it's going to cause pressure on their society. So the Ukrainians need to take advantage of that. Also, if they can get more conscripts to surrender, knowing that they're going to get treated humanely, and they're going to be fed, and they're going to be well taken care of, that could encourage more surrenders, and which will put more pressure on the Russians. So they cannot give in to the idea of revenge against these conscripts. They need to be exactly the opposite of that, and to encourage more surrendering, which will cause more pressure on Russian society. And so also this Kursk operation does boost the morale of the Ukrainian people, where at the same side it's putting pressure on the Russian people, because as I said, the campaign season is about to come to an end until the winter, when the ground hardens. And I don't care what they say, even with modern military vehicles, mud is a problem. They use up more fuel. Vehicles get stuck. They can't move as fast. Infantry is miserable in it. It's just hard to operate in. So I don't care about, mud season doesn't matter in modern technology. Oh yeah, it does, unless you have a bunch of hard roads created, and they don't, because you've seen pictures from the war. These operate a lot of times out in the countryside or on dirt paths. So it does matter, and you can see the activity of the war is that it does, Rasputitsa still plays a role in it. So as the campaign season ends, the Ukrainian population is going to be boosted, because they would have felt, at least at the end of this campaign season, this breather, they would have had a victory, where it creates a little bit of issues with the Russians, where they weren't able to make a major breakthrough in the south, and at the very end of the war, their territory was invaded by somebody that opponent they were told was defeated and corrupt. So again, it creates more pressure on the Russian side as well. And again, these are all things that they're wanting to use to try to incentivize peace talks. Again, the Russians have to disassociate any agreement to peace talks with the Kursk offensive. Now, I don't think that the Ukrainians are going to want to maintain a full presence throughout Rasputitsa and into the winter in the Kursk region, because the Russians will launch offensives to close that area as soon as they can gather reinforcements, if peace does not occur. If the Ukrainians pull out of the region and pull out in good order, and maybe either on the other side of the Russian border or within the old international border, they would have had the benefits of the offensive. The Russians will no longer have the Kursk gun to their head, and could agree to peace talks, and the Ukrainians won't risk more units into the maintaining Kursk. So I think it's in the Ukrainians' best interest, because they're not deploying enough units there to go operate indefinitely in that area, and they're not operating enough units to be able to push further and further into Russia. So I think it's in their interest to maintain this operation and then slowly withdraw and keep their units in good order without massive casualties, and then take advantage of it and or use it as a bargaining chip. If Russia agrees to peace talks, there will be a phased withdrawal out of the Kursk region. So it could give them another bargaining chip. So that's why I don't think that this Kursk operation is meant to be a long-term occupation of Russian territory. And so, again, treating POWs fine, humanely, pulling out and keeping its armed military intact. Don't turn it into a military rout. It will be difficult to operate during the Rasputitsa, so it'd be better if they start pulling back. Time will tell, but I think all the advantages for Ukraine to fully leverage this offensive would be for a phased withdrawal as they get closer and closer to October, and before the ground freezes, before it turns to mud, and then before it refreezes. I think that gives them the advantage of the best advantage to incentivize the Russians to come to the peace table. I don't think the Russians will come to the peace tables, which, again, Zelensky's pushing, the president of Ukraine is pushing. He wants Russia involved in November peace talks. I think he has to be out of Belgorod, out of Kursk before then. And that's why I think there will be a phased withdrawal. And whether that's an agreement to get the Russians to agree to peace talks, not sure. Time's going to play me out. That means it's only, 6 more weeks till October. So I guess, not even that, 5 weeks. So see if I'm wrong or see if I'm not. But I think that's where you get the full benefit of the Kursk offensive. Now, I read that a couple of comments in YouTube, which are always helpful. One is saying that the offensive's going to continue in Kursk, and they're not stopping. And it's like, well, they haven't deployed enough units to keep that offensive going all the way in the north. So what do they think they're going to do? Is go all the way to Moscow? And if that's the case of them not stopping, why would they blow up the bridges to keep the flowing of reinforcements? Because that means they would have to start crossing some of these rivers that they're blowing up bridges to me. So it tells me that they don't want to advance much further into the area. They will do raids into the area. They'll probably try to blow up bridges further behind their main line of resistance. So I don't think that they plan on operating for much deeper into the region, just because, again, there are manpower constraints on Ukraine. We got the Rasputitsa about to come, so if they start getting into a more advanced, further and further down the road, advance farther and farther in a salient that they have to pour more manpower in to guard the flanks in the middle of the mud season, or when the mud season's about to start, I don't see that happening. And then what's the other one is the Ukrainians are attacking to take over a nuclear power plant to create some type of dirty bomb warfare, contaminate the region with radiation. Okay, I've read that several times, and I guess from a weapon purpose, from a terror weapon purpose, yes, it is legitimate. Ukraine would lose a significant amount of international support if it did such a thing. You would see a lot of European Union funding dry up, or a lot more loss of support inside the European Union if they did such a thing, because any type of activity like that, just like Chernobyl, it poisoned parts of Europe. They would lose their support of Europe, or a good portion of support of Europe. They will probably lose a lot of support in the United States. So they would lose a lot of the public support that they need to keep their economy going and to keep their military machine going. They are not going in there to blow up a power plant a la Chernobyl style to contaminate large portions of the society, because again, okay, legitimate weapon, understand the point of view, a terror weapon against the Russians, really make the Russian society feel that. It would be a public relations, economic, and military loss for the Ukrainians if they did such a thing. So I think that is not something that's going to happen. So that's my opinion. We will find out if I'm right or wrong. Again, Ukraine's not talking about the reason for them doing this offensive. And again, strategic ambiguity tells you that you don't telegraph the reason why you're doing something, but they are doing it. I still think peace talks have got something to do with it. They've talked about this for over a year, is that Ukraine needed some type of win to incentivize the Russians to the peace table. So I think this is one of the things that is what they've needed. It's just not me telling you that. So we will see. Again, it's only 5 weeks away before the rain season starts, and we'll see how this goes. So I might be coming back and eating crow on this one, but we'll see. All right, so that is the discussion this week. I've kept it under 2 hours, so that was something I wanted to do. I knew it was going to be more than an hour and a half because of 4 articles. All right, so all the people that have joined as followers and subscribers this week, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Even the ones on YouTube and Rumble that have joined as well. I appreciate your support as well and the comments that you've given. We'll say that some of the comments from YouTube are a minority. A loud minority is less than constructive, but that's okay. That's just the nature of the of social media nowadays. Substack is always much more constructive, and definitely a platform where you can debate more on these types of issues. So I appreciate that. So thank you everyone for joining and supporting me. And if you have any questions or if you have any requests to discuss, please feel free to drop me a line. If you know anybody that's interested in this topic, please make recommendations of my Substack to try to get the word out so that can continues. I want to say wisdom, but I can continue to spread my point of view and give my opinion and make it an area of open debate and discussion. So I hope all of you have a great week. Thank you for joining, and I will talk to you next week.